is straight plane thinking in human movement, kind of like being a flat earther, where the model kind of looks like it works, but the more you understand it, the more you realize that it's inaccurate? Good morning. Happy Friday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand, and it is perfect. All right, we got a little bit of a complex Q&A question, so I want to dive right into it. This one comes from Johnny, and Johnny says, what are some of the key differences between early ER and hip flexion? He put quotes during flexion because Johnny gets it. He says, what's the difference between early ER and later ER in traditional hip flexion? One of my thoughts is, since there's a reorientation of external rotators above the trochanter into internal rotators within that later ER phase, there may be an increase in the magnitude of external rotation representation within the pelvis during the later ER. Would this result in more counternutation of the sacrum? Johnny, I'm loving the way you're thinking on two levels. The quotes around the hip flexion, yep, the imaginary sagittal plane, and then your thought about how the counternutation plays into this. So this is really, really good. What we want to do is we want to recognize that we've got two representations of external rotation in the pelvis. The end position of this kind of looks the same, but how we get there is a little different. So let me show those first, and then we'll try to put this together piece by piece, okay? So when I talk about external rotation of the pelvis, I have an ER ilial position and a counternutated sacrum. But if you think about it, I've got two bones that move in a relative movement to one another, and so I could have the ilium moving in this direction into ER, and that puts me in a counternutated position, relatively speaking, here. Or I could have the sacrum moving backwards. The thing I want you to recognize is that if I have the ilium sort of leading the show, I'm going to be turning that way. If I have the sacrum leading the show, I'm going to be turning that way. So this is kind of really important, because what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about how this plays into walking. So let's grab a foot, and we're going to talk about some propulsive phases here, and then we'll relate it to the pelvis. So if I'm looking at, say, late propulsion, so this is when the heel breaks from the ground, and I'm going to be pushing up and back in this direction. And so what this is going to be, this is a representation of external rotation. So I'm resupinating this foot in that late propulsive strategy. So what it's going to look like in the pelvis is that I'm going to have this ilium leading the ER show from this late propulsive position. So my leg is behind me, my heel comes up off the ground, and I'm going to be driving that ER from here. And so what that's going to do, it's going to turn the sacrum away from that late propulsive foot position. And so now there's my ER, and this is late propulsion. So I've got concentric orientation posteriorly that's pushing me forward and turning me away. Now, let's go back to the foot. So if I was on the other side, and I'm landing, and so now we're going to talk about the heel rocker position. So I come down to the ground, and when I get that first metatarsal head down on the ground, I'm in that position of ER in the foot. So this is also a supinated position of the foot, which means that up above in the pelvis, I'm going to have ER. But what I'm actually going to have now is I'm going to have a sacrum moving backwards on this ilium, and so this is the turn towards. So again, this is still a representation of external rotation because my relative positions are the same. It's just that I'm turned toward. So now I have a representation in gait of where late is and where early is. Okay, now that's all well and good if we're upright and walking on two legs, but you asked about this hip flexion thing, and so now we have to look at it a little bit differently. So if I'm measuring somebody on the table, or if I'm performing a squat, I'm actually looking at this more as a quadrupedal type of a gait situation. So I'm going to look at this hip here. So if I was a quadruped and I was walking, as I step forward, my early representation is going to be here, and my late representation is going to be here. And so now, if I look at this in the later stages of ER in a squat, what I'm actually doing is I'm representing this early propulsive strategy, which means I've got the sacrum moving backwards on the ilium to make that turn. So as I step forward, and right as I start to weight that extremity, I'm going to turn like that, and so that becomes becomes my early representation, just like when I was at the end of the heel rocker in the foot, I'm going to have that delay right there. That creates the delay strategy that allows me to start to slow down that leg side so the other side can then step forward. Now, the thing that I want you to recognize about this is that it looks like it's in some imaginary straight plane that doesn't exist. It looks like it's an arc, but it's not an arc. It's a series of shape changes in the pelvis that allows us to access spaces around us and to produce the turning that's associated with the shape change. If we start to think of this stuff in arcs like the imaginary sagittal plane and imaginary frontal planes, it's going to limit our understanding about how the active strategies produce movement or interfere with movement and limit our movement options. So for instance, if I was an Olympic weightlifter and I had this posterior compressive strategy on the back of the pelvis, then I know I'm not going to be able to access this deeper range of external rotation that I would need from my squat. So what's going to happen is that instead of being able to squat here, I'm actually going to have to move the leg outward, and that's not even external rotation. That's actually an internal rotation strategy that's going to allow me to finish that deep squat. If I don't understand the fact that I'm producing shape changes that produce turns into ER and IR, I won't understand how I can apply load to a split squat to emphasize capturing more internal rotation or more external rotation. So to wrap all this up, what I want you to recognize is that when we're talking about the external rotations that are moving through the pelvis via these shape changes and turns, this initial phase of hip movement in ER is actually this late propulsive strategy, and then as I get into this deeper range of ER, this is actually going to be represented by my early propulsive strategies. So hopefully that answers your question, Johnny. Great question. I really think that this is an important point to clarify for people, because I think they're getting caught up in a lot of straight plane thinking that we just have to start to eliminate, because it's going to limit our ability to select the appropriate interventions. Everybody have a great Friday, and I'll see you next week.